Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And actually, this is going to be a double feature. This is going to be featured on Engaging the Phenomenon and my newer channel, Exploring Higher Realities, because as you will hear here, it's going to be very appropriate due to this conversation. And today we are honored to have on Riz Virk or Rizwan Virk. And he's a computer scientist, author, or best-selling author, uh, entrepreneur, and modern day mystical synthesizer. So welcome, Riz.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on your show. And that's a nice way to describe some of the things that I do.
Yeah, and we were talking before. You're all over the place. I see you at all these upcoming events. I think you are at Contact in the Desert, correct?
Yeah, I was there for the first time this year, actually. And I
Yeah,
spoke there once before, but it was the year that they had canceled the in-person event during COVID. So,
yeah,
fun. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So you're at a bunch of upcoming events, and you're known. I would say a lot for the simulation theory idea. You wrote a book called The Simulation Hypothesis. There's a new edition that is just launching, and yeah, show it. I love the new cover. The
Yeah, so here's the new edition. So even for people that have the old edition, there's about 100 pages of extra and new content. And we're calling it the definitive edition. So pretty excited about that. That's coming out July 22nd. So depending on when this airs, it may already be available.
Yeah, and I love this. I love what you did with that book. I remember getting it when it originally came out, and you know, not to mention, if people read the kind of the blurbs, that you got a blurb by Jacques Vallée, right? The
Yes.
godfather of ufology,
Yes.
and Diana Pasulka, right? So if they're interested in it, you will be too, right? Uh, no, but really, this just the meeting of ideas and concepts of contemporary thinking with mystical traditions, and you put it in such a relatable and understandable context, in my opinion. And you know, you know, we're really talking about like the kind of nature of reality. So these deeper questions, but also it makes a lot of sense in the way where like people in that are researching UFOs or the UFO phenomenon and even psychic phenomenon nowadays, it's clear that there's something more going on, right? There's deeper and bigger questions than okay, yeah, there's like this tic tac or this UFO and there's a metal object with some beings inside, and that's the end of the story. Anybody who's been researching these subjects for more than a few minutes is going to realize that there's way more going on. And then even the idea of the religious context, right? Of as long as that there's been written human history, there's been stories about non-human intelligence, this idea that we're living in Maya, right? Like a
Yep.
constructed reality rather than taking reality at face value. So just to start this off for people watching and listening, what really is the simulation hypothesis?
Well, I think, that it bridges a lot of different areas that you've mentioned. And that's why I was attracted to it. And that's why I ended up, writing this book originally and ended up updating it now because when I wrote it originally, ChatGPT hadn't been introduced yet. AI is a key part of the story. I mean, the subtitle on the book is an MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics agree we are all in a video game. So that's really bringing together all these different threads that many people who investigate the phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon, or the mystical phenomenon might be interested in. But the basic idea is that what we think of as physical reality, this desk, this chair behind me, the physical world is actually not physical at all, that it's actually a computer generated universe. And the term that's often used for that is it's a computer simulation. Or in my book, I talk about it being much more like a video game. And now you can take that at, in different ways. And there's what I call an access of this of how you decide to approach this topic. You could view it as, is the physical world literally a computer simulation? Or you can view it as a metaphor for the ultimate nature of reality, and to say that the video game is the best metaphor we have to date. In the same way that the ancients used different metaphors along the way, that the world is like a dream, and they used the term Maya. But I came to this idea because in my background is as a computer scientist, and then I became an entrepreneur in the software industry, and I started making video games. And it was through looking at how technology would evolve over the next not just few years, but really next few decades, possibly even centuries, to see if we would get to the point where we could create something like the Matrix. And I call that the simulation point. It's a kind of technological singularity. We can talk more about that as well. And what happened to me was, and I've told this story before, some people may have heard it, but I was playing a virtual reality ping pong game all the way back in 2016, which now I guess is, we're
Wow,
looking at,
almost 10 years ago.
yeah, almost 10 years ago, which is amazing because it used to be, oh, this just happened, but this happened quite a while ago now.
Yeah.
And I was playing the VR ping pong game, and the game was so realistic that for a moment, for an instant, my body forgot that I was in virtual reality. And I tried to put the paddle down on the table, and I tried to lean against the table. And of course, there was no table.
Mm.
And the controller fell to the floor. And then I began to wonder, how long would it take us to build something like the Matrix that was completely indistinguishable from physical reality, not just for an instant, which is what happened to me. It was kind of an instinctive reaction, but really on an ongoing basis. So that's what got me down the rabbit hole. But really, as I started to investigate the weirdness of quantum mechanics, I realized, oh, this would make more sense in a simulated universe using my background from computer science and how we build video games and how we optimize information. And then as I started to look in the world's mystical traditions, that's where I began to realize, oh, they were just using metaphors to describe ultimate reality. They had to use metaphors that have been understood back then. And I believe the video game is the best metaphor to describe all types of mystical experiences. And that's partly why I wrote Wisdom of a Yogi, which we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, and it's so funny. You said, there was no table, and it reminds me of the scene from The Matrix is there is no spoon. Uh, and I want to know how you navigate this idea of this simulated, right? Like the simulation, because the simulation hypothesis or theory allows for like again different levels of reality that we live in this consensus reality and have experienced what we consider anomalous, right? Just because we don't understand necessarily what's going on. Uh, but how do you reconcile or contemplate the idea that if we're in something like a simulation or simulated reality, then therefore it's not real, right? So how do you navigate the issue of being in a simulation, but it's somewhat real, but it also at the same time an illusion, so to speak,
Yeah, well, this is, I think, one of the trickier
right?
aspects of simulation theory. And I think it hits upon what I like to call the NPC versus RPG versions of simulation theory, or flavors of simulation theory. And NPC stands for non-player character. And those are the characters inside a video game that are completely controlled by AI or by computer code. So if you play a video game and there's all these other characters there, there's these orcs you're battling against, or often it's not even enemies, it's just other characters like the bartender,
Yeah.
or at the local pub or inn, if you will, the map maker, the person selling, the arms at the armory, etc. Or somebody that shows up to give you some clues along the way for your quest. So these are all considered
Yeah.
NPCs. And in the NPC version of the simulation hypothesis, we're all literally inside a computer running, and there is no existence for us outside that simulation. Not that there isn't an existence outside the simulation, but not for us because we happen to be characters that are in the simulation. In the RPG version, which I stands for the role-playing version, sorry, role-playing game version, it's more like a video game where you have a player and the player has a character, or what's called an avatar, is the term that's used often in the video game world. And that term, of course, comes from ancient Sanskrit. And the term itself was used when a divine entity incarnates into a small body on Earth. And so there was this sense of descending down into a small body. And when the guys who made one of the first MMORPGs, it wasn't really massively multiplayer online role-playing game, but let's say it was a multiplayer online role-playing game back in the 80s called Habitat. They were at Lucasfilm, which is George Lucas's company, and they were doing computer graphics, and they built this game called Habitat, and they were looking for a term to describe the little 2D character. Now you got to remember these are very basic graphics back then, and very limited functionality. But they said it felt like they were taking their big self and they were squeezing into the telephone lines because they were using modems on a Commodore 64,
Yeah.
and they were squeezing into this little body, this little 2D, character on the screen. And so they decided to use the term avatar to convey that, and that it stuck. And so in the RPG version, we are the avatars, the characters, and our players exist outside of the game. And so that is how you can navigate, I think, the gap, what's typically a gap between science and religion. And one of the aspects of uh, this theory, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was it provides a common terminology so that you can talk. I mean, I can go to MIT and Harvard and other places like that, and I can talk to them about the nature of reality by using a simulation theory or simulation hypothesis or a video game metaphor. And I can also, you mentioned Jacques Vallée, I can talk about UFOs, and you mentioned Diana Pasulka, and I can go talk to, religious fundamentalists. I can talk to mystical Sufis. I can talk to Buddhist monks, Tibetan monks about these ideas using this one way of looking at it. And part of the reason why is because of the RPG version, because you have the player is in some sense analogous to the soul, and the character, the avatar, is inside the world. Now, what happened in the Matrix? In the Matrix, Neo plugged in using what we would call, excuse me, a brain computer interface or BCI that was plugged into the back of his head. And of course, he had been doing that since birth. So if you get rid of the evil AI that's keeping humanity trapped inside a matrix, but you say there is some interface that once you connect, you basically are forgetting about the world outside. Now you remember kind of my VR experience, right? Where I forgot for a moment, but you forget as long as you're connected to the world. So then you can start to think about the experiences here. It's not that they aren't real. I mean, for example, are you and I really having this conversation?
I hope so for my sanity. Really say,
Right? But we're
no,
actually
no.
not, right? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
talking to my computer,
Right, correct.
and you're talking to your computer, and the bits are being transmitted. So just because we're doing this virtually does not mean we're not having the conversation, or that it isn't a meaningful conversation. I mean, suppose we were talking about you going to Japan. Suppose you were to learn Japanese inside a video game, or you were to have an experience like that. Does that mean that wasn't real? Well, it's real from the character's point of view inside the game. Just like, a character can't walk through a wall inside a video game. Um, I can't, walk through the walls here. Well, perhaps there are some people who can, but
Yeah.
I can't. Probably most of us can't. And but then they're also real from the perspective of the person outside of the player. Because again, if you learn Japanese in a video game or in a Zoom call, that doesn't mean you don't know Japanese afterwards. So those experiences, have an impact on you. And I think that gets to the ultimate nature of reality itself. So that was kind of a long-winded answer to your question, I know, but it touches on a lot of aspects of simulation theory.
Right. And so with all that in mind, uh ha, where do you see the, let's say, the UFO phenomenon uh fitting into simulation theory?
Well, so I think the UFO phenomena and other phenomenon, might be classified as what I like to refer to as glitches in the matrix in some cases. Now, the UFO phenomenon, as you know, because you're in this world quite a bit, is pretty broad, right? And there are different aspects. The funny thing is that originally, I was an entrepreneur by day, I was dealing with venture capitalists and managing people and finances and technology. And in the evenings and on the weekends, I would fly off to, places like the Monroe Institute, and I would try out different aspects of consciousness and exploring shamanic journeying, for example. Uh, and I remember thinking a lot of that stuff is is interesting, but it's also very subjective. And when I got involved with the UFO phenomenon, which was back in like 2011, 2010, 2011, which is almost 15 years ago now, like in a more serious way, as opposed to just being a fan of, say, the X-Files or something like that. I remember thinking, oh, okay, here's something concrete, nuts and bolts.
Right.
And then as soon
Right.
as you get into it, you realize, oh, wow, there's actually a lot of weird stuff going on here with this phenomena that is not just nuts and bolts. And so what I found is that um, the UFO phenomenon itself, also you can think of it in terms of an axis. And there is the traditional idea that uh, these are aliens and they're coming from another planet in our physical universe. And that fits into the simulation hypothesis reasonably well, because if you were to build a multiplayer video game, um, many of them have multiple planets and they have different civilizations on each of those planets. And if you were running simulations, you might try to see. In fact, that might be one of the goals of the game, is to see how do these civilizations interact with each other, right? So that's one way in which it interacts. The other way that it interacts, I think, is interesting, is when you get to the less uh, kind of ET version of the UFO phenomenon. Um, you get into, we mentioned Jacques Vallée and Diana Pasulka, which is the overlap with many traditional religious ideas and mythology. And there's a great cover for one of Jacques' books, Passport to Magonia, where it shows like an entity with like a gray alien type face, but it's a mask. And then there's these other masks they put on. So it's almost saying that, we are interpreting these beings, especially when you get into the abduction phenomenon, that these stories have been around forever, but they are presenting themselves to us in a way that actually culturally makes sense to us. And so, for example, you have the stories of the Fae in the British Isles, and throughout Europe, you have similar types of legends and traditions. In the Middle East, there's the jinn, who are considered other beings that live here on Earth with us, but we can't normally see, but they're able to perceive into our reality. They're also able to be outside of time and space, and that might play for an interesting story later if we get into that. But so there's this aspect that somehow these beings are projecting themselves into our reality. And when you look at the stories, particularly of contact stories, you have things like people going through walls, you have objects that are appearing and disappearing. It's almost like they're materializing into our reality. And if you look at it from the point of view of a video game, um, the way you get around is you don't always travel a straight line from planet A to planet B. You actually portal over from one place to the other because it would take too long to go there. And this idea that we can materialize in different locations, even from, section A of planet A to section B, there are usually ways to do that. And so that got me thinking about this idea that perhaps these crafts are materializing into our reality and they're rendering in the same way that, so in a video game, the rules get solid once everything is rendered. But when they're not rendered, there's some flexibility for people to move through walls and do other things. People have probably seen this if they've played a video game and they're glitching while they're still rendering.
Yeah.
But once
Yeah.
once everything is solid, it really is solid. So could we be in a state where we're not as physical as we think? And it was Jacques that got me thinking about this actually, because he told me about several incidents that I found really interesting. And then Gary Nolan told me about some other incidents. And then Whitley Strieber mentioned one or two incidents. And each of these incidents kind of reminded me of aspects of either simulation theory or aspects of these other beings like the jinn, for example. But one of them was Jacques said he was investigating a case it was like Northern California or Southern Oregon. It was somewhere up in the Pacific Northwest, and he said that the witnesses claimed they saw the craft come down at a 45-degree angle, and then it made some marks on the ground. And he went out there to investigate along with other folks in the UFO community. And I guess Jacques stayed longer than the rest of them, so he tends to get to know the witnesses and spend more time with them. What we would call more of a qualitative approach, I think. In addition to, he has this database that he's been building for in many different iterations since the days of Blue Book, I guess. But he said to them, well, one of the things I don't understand is you said it came down at a 45-degree angle and it landed here, but he looked up and he pointed at the trees because this was like, say, a clearing or something, with these giant redwood trees. We're talking about the Pacific Southwest. He said that would have meant that the UFO would have had to go through the trees and before it landed here. And they said something to the effect of, yes, that's what happened, but we didn't want to say that to the other investigators because we would sound crazy. Right? And so now you get into this question of, is it a physical object or isn't it? And the answer may be both. It may be that it's while it's rendering or resing, it's actually a non-physical object that is being rendered. And then once it's fully rendered, then it becomes a physical object. And so that was pretty interesting to me. And then another area, and then this ties not just to UFOs, but ties to all kinds of other phenomena like the telepathy tapes and psi. And I'm going to be speaking at the psi games here in Charlottesville pretty soon. But this idea that different observers might see different things. And this is really baffling when you think about it, because we're used to thinking of UFOs from our Western cultural, mode of thinking. Our paradigms are very much a materialistic paradigm. Either the UFO is there or it's not. Either it's round or it's not, right? That's it. It's not like it can be round and it can be a cylinder shape and it can be something else. But that that is something that happens, is that there have been cases where one person saw the UFO and the other people around them didn't see it. And so that's a strange. Or there was one story that I think Gary Nolan told me about, that where they were sitting next to each other in the car, and one person saw like a donut
Yeah.
shaped, and one saw like a cylinder shaped. And so this is quite separate from. There's another phenomenon where there's a UFO and only one person looks because they're drawn to it and nobody else is. But this is where other people are looking and they don't see anything. And so how could that possibly happen? And it turns out in a simulated universe or a video game environment, that's actually not that hard to do, because we do it all the time. For example, I see your bookshelf behind you and there's a Buddha statue there, but how do I
Yeah.
know those are really there? Or how do I know that's not been rendered on my screen? Because you
Yeah.
can change your virtual background. Now, the Zoom virtual background feature is not so good. If I just move my head, you
Yeah.
can kind of tell, right? Today, but give it, 100 years, give it 10 years, forget 100 years.
Yeah.
It'll be so good that you won't be able to distinguish it, because AI will constantly correct everything that needs to be done. And so in a video game, we do this all the time. We send back information from the server to the client. And my point with that thing about the background and the little Buddha statue behind you, is that I'm not really talking to you. I'm rendering the scene on my computer. You're rendering it on your computer. And the people that are watching us, they're rendering it on their local computer. So it's what we would call a distributed model within computer science. And so what happens is the server sends just bits of information, often compressed information. That information is then interpreted by the code that happens to be running on that computer at that time. And then things are rendered. So it's very easy in a video game for you and I to be in a field together, and for me to look up and say, well, what a beautiful sky, there's nothing there. And you to say, watch out, there's a dragon. The dragon is going to, it's going to, breathe fire and it's going to destroy you,
Yeah.
because you may be at level 30 and you have the perceive, dragon spell or ability, and my character doesn't. And so is there a personalization of a reality going on? Not to say that there isn't a shared reality, but is there perhaps tweaks in this shared reality because each of us are rendering it on our own devices? Or in the case of the Matrix, we'd all be rendering it on a physical brain. Or in the case of a more spiritual interpretation, we'd all be rendering it, in some other spiritual capacity. So it's, in that case, the machine is not a physical machine per se. So those are some areas where I found that these things do tend to overlap.
Yeah, and interesting idea that came up while you were sharing those ideas is that, say, some kind of advanced non-human intelligence wanted to interact with us or interface with us, they could be sending information into our reality that we decode as craft, being, and whatnot. And because they're sending information through, they can manipulate the information rather than it being like just say them physically. And
Right.
so for them to materialize and dematerialize and go through solid objects, they could project information into our reality, and that could answer a lot of question as to, well, how is this object able to move at this speed? Well, because it's not an actual object per se, it's a
Right.
perceived object, but it's actually coded information. One of the really cool things too about Jacques Vallée's the newest volume, I forget what year anniversary edition it was for
Was
the
it version 6, was it? Or I
no, no,
forget
no, no,
which
no,
version.
the Passport to Magonia.
Oh, okay, okay, yeah.
I think it's like the 50th or 60th year anniversary. And in the non-human intelligence or the alien figure, he has the symbol or symbolization of the control system or the meta system that he talks about, and it's a shadow hand that's in the puppet
Ah,
of the alien. So he makes it one more step meta,
right,
which is really cool. I really love that addition. He said that was the actual original addition, but they didn't want to go with that, so he went with the alien as the has with all the different caricatures.
right.
Um,
Well, it's an interesting point you make about projecting information, and what it means is what we're seeing are the avatars of someone else, whether they are other beings here on Earth, outside in a different dimension, outside of this physical dimension, or even perhaps they're on another planet, but they're able to access a higher dimension, and so they're able to project across. I mean, it would make sense that if we're going to send craft to other star systems, we would send AI initially. And I work a lot with science fiction. We've talked about The Matrix, several times here. But there are other interesting science fiction themes around this. I gave a talk recently at I was at Arizona State University, and I gave a talk about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is one of the better known films in this genre. And it's interesting that Steven Spielberg is coming back to the UFO topic
yeah,
here real soon. But as I was talking about the overlap between the fiction and the real life themes around UFO research, around Jacques perhaps being the inspiration for the French scientist, but also this idea of mass sightings. In the film, I think they take place in Indiana, which is right near where I grew up in Michigan as well. But there are all these elements. But one of the areas that Jacques said he disagreed with Steven Spielberg on the movie was that in the film they are just aliens, right?
yeah, yeah,
And so, in a sense, there are all these real life UFO narratives that were informing a film like Close Encounters. So, a science fiction is being informed by actual things going on as well as our actual science. But then the science fiction turns around and it influences our ability to think about what's actually happening. So, we now, you have Whitley's, Communion book with the gray alien. You have all the 50s movies about aliens from Mars, right? And so when we see something unexplained, we put it into that bucket, that technological bucket. And the media is as guilty of this as anyone. And I think serious UFO researchers, keep an open mind about the nature of the phenomena. But like, for example, I wrote about UFOs for NBC News at one point, and I was gonna write about them for CNN, but that's a whole different story where they ended up going with, very skeptical kind of traditional academic approach rather than more of an open-minded approach. But even then, it was like And the title of my article was "The Pentagon, the government takes UFOs seriously. Why doesn't academia or Silicon Valley?" And even then, my editor was like, "Okay, don't get into these weird ideas about what these things could be. It's either aliens or not."
Yeah.
And there was a I think it was Discovery Channel show. They wanted me to interview me, and I said, "Well, look, I don't think it's just aliens or it's nothing." And they were like, "No, no, no, we don't want that. We just want to talk about aliens because it's almost like the public can understand that because of the science fiction and the cultural context that we built, and that's called something that's called the sci-fi feedback loop, where science fiction influences real world technologies, but also real world cultural narratives, and then those cultural narratives then influence our science fiction. But we're viewing everything through a lens. I guess is the main point I'm trying to make there.
Yeah, and that point that you made about people can understand that, right? And gets to I've had Jim Semivan on here a few times, who also they just released his talk at it was an interview facilitated by the Soul Foundation,
Right.
which you're involved with,
Yeah.
and he when I've had Jim on, we often come back to this idea of the indigestible aspect of the UFO phenomenon. Like, how do you explain this to everybody? Jim is kind of like he on both sides of the conversation of, well, this is so complex to just dump the like a disclosure on the world, right? It like how could people handle it? But at the same time, he's for in the limited sense, right? Of like letting the reality of it be known to the public that we're not alone, so to speak. Not necessarily the national security implication stuff, which is why it gets knotty at different aspects when we're talking about disclosure. Um, but another thing you had mentioned uh, uh, prior, which I thought was really interesting, is somebody might have a spell or whatever to enhance their perception to perceive different things in the game. And I mentioned it before. I'm wearing a solo leveling shirt. People might recognize that. And in the game, in the anime and the manga and stuff, he's like his perception ability is developing as he's going through as he's leveling up.
Oh,
And because
interesting.
of that, and they casually, they never overemphasize it, which I like they casually put it in there, like his perception is expanding as he's on this journey and as he's leveling up, and he can perceive enemies from further away, he can perceive what they're feeling and stuff. And this idea of your perception can be augmented as you level up through the game, I thought is a really kind of fun, but like a relatable concept. In the idea of like you did the book Wisdom of a Yogi, and with the yogas and stuff, you're developing your perception or clearing it through different practices. And I love how this actually fits in, whether you're talking about the UFO phenomenon or the nature of reality itself. Because, again, in the yogas, you're clearing your perception, you're perceiving more of what reality actually is, or you're perceiving more of the simulation, right? Um, so, what how do you uh think about that idea of like of yoga and perceiving more of the simulation?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we do that, let me just mention on this topic itself, which is this idea of the spells or the levels. Some of it is your abilities to perceive, I think, and some of it might be the phenomenons wanting you to perceive. And
Right.
in this edition, I added a lot about unexplained phenomena, and one of the areas that I talked about was ghosts. And there are again instances where one person can see the ghost and one can't. And you and I mentioned Leslie Kane earlier, before we started recording, and she has a book called Surviving Death, and there's an interesting story in there. I think it was actually one she included from another ghost investigator, which was happened in Oakland, and there was this family that moved into this house, and the young boy was able to see this woman who was dressed in kind of funny old clothes, and it turns out her name was the name of the previous owner. And at some point, they found out through the child that the woman could communicate with him more easily, but also there are different times when the ghost could decide to be seen or not seen. So, like there was the guys were driving and one person like perceived her while he was in the car. So there's this whole thing going on where it's almost like they're beaming to your specific consciousness, a signal or a set of information that you render that others can't. So I think that's pretty interesting. Now, yeah, let's talk a little bit about Wisdom of a Yogi, which is the book that I wrote about Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. And it's interesting because I had been writing about simulation theory. And my very first book, by the way, was called Zen Entrepreneurship. So it was
Yes.
kind of an account of this double life I was leading, where I would, be exploring consciousness in the evenings and in the weekends, and I'd be, actually running a company during the day. But what happened was after I wrote the first edition of the simulation hypothesis, I got an email from HarperCollins in India saying, "Oh, it's the 75th anniversary of Wisdom of a Yogi." I'm sorry, of Autobiography of a
Yeah.
Yogi, which came out in 1946. So this was back in like 21, 22, I think. Um, and they said, "We'd like to release a new book for the Indian market." So one of the things that's happened with Autobiography of a Yogi is something academics call the pizza effect. I don't know if you've ever heard of this.
No, I
Uh,
haven't. No.
so the pizza fact is pizza originates from some region in Italy. I forget what region. Maybe it's
Right.
Naples or but it's not kind of like what we think of as pizza. It was just some bread with some stuff on there. And then it came to the US. And then here we kind of created what we think of as the modern version of pizza with cheese and all this stuff on there. And now if you go to Italy, you can order pizza that's a lot like the pizza that we did.
Okay,
So
cool. Yeah,
so
yeah.
pizza went back to Italy. And in this sense, Yogananda lived his life, his adult life primarily here in the US. And so, but his teachings, and he only went back to India, I think, once in 1935 for, this extended sort of vacation. But from 1920 till his death, when he was like in his 50s, he was in America and he wrote for Americans. I mean, if you read Autobiography of Yogi, they'll include Indian terms like Maya, and other Sanskrit terms like karma, but they'll be kind of in the footnotes a lot of times. He'll be trying to use Western terminology. So in a sense, he was trying to bridge the gap between a Western Christian audience and the yogic teachings of India, which go back many thousands of years. And in Wisdom of a Yogi, one of the things that I talk about is the definition of yoga from Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra, which Yogananda also talks about in his book. And he defined yoga. Let's see if I can get remember the Sanskrit here. It's like yogash chitta
Naroda, Chitti
naroda,
Naroda. Yeah.
chitta vritti
Yeah.
naroda,
Yeah.
which basically means yoga is the cessation of the vrittis, uh, or the chitta vrittis. And what does that mean? Well, chitta is the mind stuff, but what vrittis means is whirlpools. Literally, the word means literal, like a whirlpool. And so what he was really trying to say was that there are all these thoughts that we are having, and that the thoughts are like these crazy whirlpools all around us. And when we basically start to stop all these crazy thoughts, they don't harden into what eventually becomes samskaras, which then stay as part of our informational coding beyond this life. That's my term, informational coding, which others might call karma as well. But I kind of view it like those old snow globes, right? So if you have a snow globe, you can see everything that's going on. But if you shake it up, what happens? All of the little snow pieces get everywhere, and you can't see as well. And so the vrittis, they need to have a whirlpool inside something. What is that something? And I did kind of a reinterpretation of uh, the translation of that term, and I said, well, yoga is um, uh, the cessation of the whirlpools of thought and feeling in the river of consciousness. So, when you have whirlpool, you need to have something that it's a whirlpool in. Now, in the yoga traditions, they also talk about the kosas, which are like these sheaths that surround us. And so, in fact, what happens is the vrittis become hardened. They turn into samskaras and also what are called vasanas, which are like these tendencies that we have across lives. And I view it, the process, if you've ever, I mean, I know you practice Kriya Yoga, and many of the people that are listening to this may practice some type of meditation or some type of physical yoga. And it was interesting to me because I got into the meditation side first, and then later I started to do more hatha yoga.
Yeah.
And when I did hatha yoga, I realized, oh, something is stilled at the end of the session.
Yeah. Yes.
When you do
Yeah.
shavasana and you're kind of laying there, and well, what is it that's stilled, right? Well, there's different ways to interpret it. But in the yoga traditions, you're interpreting it as these crazy whirlpools are stilled, so you are calm, and now you can perceive. And that, I think, is the end goal of a lot of these spiritual processes, which is to be able to perceive that which you really are versus that which is illusion around us, right? I mean, the Buddha literally means, the term Buddha really literally means I'm awake. Because a woman asked him, "What are you?" And he said, "I'm Buddha," which I guess in that terminology meant he was awake. And they started calling him the Buddha. Well, if he's awake, that means the rest of us are asleep. So now we get into this idea of the dream metaphor, and how does the dream metaphor relate to the simulation hypothesis? And I think it relates very well, right? The ancients have been telling us that the real world around us is not the real world. And they use the term Maya. But if you look at Maya more, uh, you look at it in different ways, and you look at what the scholars say about it, it's usually translated as illusion. But there's a more subtle translation, which is that it's kind of a carefully crafted illusion. It's almost like a magic show. This is the explanation that I like. And when you go to a magic show, you know the guy's not really cutting the woman in half, right?
Yeah.
But you go there to see it, and you're like, wow. That is cool. Now we're having this conversation, I think, on the weekend that Superman movie came out, right? And part of the reason you go to the films like that is you escape into this other world. And in the new DC universe, I'm not really spoiling much, I think. They say 300 years ago, metahumans appeared on the Earth. 30 years ago, Superman came as a baby. 3 years ago, Superman revealed himself. But the point is, they're building up a mythology of this world that includes, the DC extended universe and these other superheroes, but it's a kind of illusion. And so what's happened is that the sages over time have come up with different metaphors and different ways to explain this concept. And that's what a video game is, in a sense. If you have a fully immersive video game, you are going through that process of forgetting. The soul goes into the body, and there's some metaphors that are used in, like Rumi, for example, says that the soul enters the body just like the body puts on a set of clothes.
Yeah.
And the clothes is, I mean, that's a technological metaphor in a sense. And clothes are technology, if you think about it.
Yeah.
That's trying to explain something that's almost ineffable. Even in the Quran, they use this term, God breathes the soul, the ruh, into the physical body. And then in the Bhagavad Gita, you have a line that's almost the exact same metaphor, which is that, the soul puts on and takes off bodies as if they were garments, right? So I forget the exact translation, but that's the basic meaning of it. And so now you see they're using the exact same metaphor between, in this case, a Sufi mystic and in the Bhagavad Gita. And you find similar metaphors being used across different traditions. And the only thing I think you can conclude from that is that they're trying to describe something real, but they're trying to describe it in a way that people of that time would be able to understand it. And so Yogananda was great at this. So I mentioned that, he didn't use a lot of the Indian terminology in Autobiography of a Yogi, which became, for many people, their introduction to meditation and yoga, especially in the 60s during the counterculture. And
Yeah.
Steve Jobs, it was his favorite book. They gave away copies at his funeral, in a little box. He went to India trying to look for, I think it was Neem Karoli Baba, but that he had already passed away at that point. And so, mostly what he did was read Autobiography of a Yogi and wander around India. And it became, the only book on his iPad when he died. Well, but Yogananda was great at providing new metaphors. And so originally, when they asked me to write this book, I was like, wait, you sure you want me to write a book about Yogananda, for India? I mean, first of all, I'm from Pakistan, not India. Secondly, I'm not even Hindu, even though I've spent a lot of time studying the Buddhist tradition, studying the Hindu tradition, studying the Islamic traditions. And I'm more of an entrepreneur, and I write about technology and I write about simulation theory. And they said, well, yes, we'd like you to write this book because we want it to appeal to a younger generation who are more technologically savvy. And so we want you to make these analogies. And so, as I said, Yogananda made a new metaphor using the latest technologies when he came here in the 1920s. And he would say that life is like a film projector, right? And that the actors on the screen, the characters on the screen, they may be suffering and they may even die, but that doesn't mean that the actors that play them are dying. And he would always say, I mean, there's a great film about Yogananda's life called Awake. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've seen it.
Yeah.
And there's a scene in there, and they have a clip from there. And I use it sometimes when I'm giving speeches to talk about this idea of technological metaphors. And he says, "It is all movies to me. It is just plays of shadow, light, and dark." And he would tell his students, "You have to look away from the screen sometimes and look at the light that's being projected." It's like shadows of light from the Lord, and that the light was what's important. Now that was a metaphor that would make sense, but it was using the latest technology. I mean, film projectors were still relatively new in the 1920s. I think we still had silent movies back then, right? And Yogananda loved going to the movies. And there's an episode in Autobiography of a Yogi where he had seen a scene from World War I, which was the first real mechanized war, if you think about it. And so the scale of killing, I mean, there's a reason they called it the Great War at the time. The scale of killing was much larger than they had ever seen before because they had machine guns um, and they were even starting to use planes a little bit. And so he was like, Lord, how can you allow this? And he that's when he first got the message that this is like a film that's going on. But I believe if Yogananda were alive today, he would do exactly the same thing he did in the 1920s, in the 2020s. He would use the latest technology to help describe something that is very complicated to understand. But when you use these metaphors, it becomes much easier. And he would say it's like a movie, but it's also an interactive movie. There's a script. You have a script, but you don't have to follow it. You can change the script. And we're the actors in the film. We are the characters, but we're also the audience. We're also watching ourselves. So what does that sound like? To me, that sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, right? So I think he would use that analogy. So that's why I felt comfortable writing this book that was really tying together my work in simulation hypothesis with a lot of the teachings of the ancient traditions from Yogananda, but also other yogic teachers over time as well.
Yeah, and funny enough, actually, Jacques Vallée uses a similar quote in trying to understand the phenomenon, and he says, you know, the UFO phenomenon, or maybe the control system, is like a projection running from a projection booth, and he wants to get to the booth and see the projection itself, the thing that's
Projector.
manifesting the projections. you
Oh,
know
interesting. I didn't
yeah,
know he'd use that analogy. That's
he
interesting.
did, and it's a really good one. And
Yeah. Now that's
this
very interesting that he's using the exact same analogy for the phenomenon as
yeah,
Yogananda used for describing reality, which today would translate, I think, into a computer generated type of projection. Yeah.
right, and I think Valet would agree with that. That
And
kind of
Jacques is a computer scientist, he and I sat down. In fact, even before I had written this book, he was really helpful to me. He actually wrote the foreword for the French edition of the simulation hypothesis in French.
yeah,
So he
yeah.
was very nice about that. I mean, I don't know if he's 100% convinced of everything and about the simulation, but I think he believes, along with many other scientists, that the world consists of information and that information gets rendered for us. And that's really what the simulation hypothesis is about, I think.
Yeah, and when it comes to the UFO subject, at least, I really appreciate that it's again, like you were saying before, it's we have something concrete here, right? Seemingly, and I've called the UFO phenomenon like the bridge between physics and metaphysics, because you have something that's seemingly a physical object, right? In comparison to, let's say, mist, you know, general mystical experiences seem very subjective, right? Um, no matter how valid or invalid. But the with the UFO phenomenon, you have something that's like tracked on radar, gun camera footage, of all these like anomalous events, it seems the most concrete. There seems to be something objective there where different people are viewing it from different vantage points, and it's being tracked on radar and gun camera footage and what have you. And there's even biological effects and physical traces, but it's performing feats that we would consider metaphysical, right? And so I think that it helps bridge the idea of physics and metaphysics to the extent where metaphysics is simply a physics that we just don't understand quite yet, right?
Yeah.
And even something like the telepathy tapes, right?
Right.
I think the modern conversation around UFOs or UAP, as it's now being called, has allowed for a broader conversation, right? Like
Yeah.
I think the 2017 kind of revelations and the New York Times article and everything that's developed since then,
Mhm.
uh, whether people realize it or not, has had a cultural impact or effect in that. Well, if you say UFOs are real, right? If the Pentagon's investigating them, well, we don't know what they are, but they're real. That allows for kind of anything, right? Like you have to just kind of say, oh, well, if that's real, what else is real? Um,
Yeah, and
so
that's the term NHI as well, right?
right,
Non-human intelligence, rather than saying aliens or saying,
right. It's really developed, and just like we use UAP now instead of UFO more so, um, in part because it allows for a broader spectrum of investigation and analysis, saying that it's just an unidentified flying object into unidentified anomalous phenomena, which could actually mean anything really, anything unknown that is a phenomena is able to be put into this category. And so actually, with that in mind, so from when you first put out the simulation hypothesis to now, there's a lot has changed. So
yeah,
considering the new edition, what's some of the newer things that you had to put in there because
yeah,
of where we are in just a short time, right? Like we've gone
yeah,
from like regular kind of Google to like Chat GPT 4 and 5 is coming out soon, and AI and the developments with UAP and again telepathy tapes, like and something that is ultra also interesting is like the telepathy tapes that surpassed like Joe Rogan for like a week, right, in
right.
podcasts. But it's speaking to the interest that people have in this kind of thing. It wasn't just like a kind of woo thing, right? People were looking at it. It became to number one. So, what are some of the newer things that you had to include in the new edition because the times are moving so fast, it seems.
Yeah, well, so, as you pointed out, we have a lot more in terms of AI. So, given that AI was in the subtitle all along, I was projecting what might happen with AI. And in the book, I talk about the 10 stages of technology we would need to reach the simulation point. And AI was one of those. But we weren't very far along. In fact, at the time in 2019, there was debate about whether the Turing test, how far away we were, not just from AGI, but just from being able to pass the Turing test. And today, I think the general consensus among most researchers is that the Turing test has more or less been passed already by these LLMs, by ChatGPT, Claude, Grok, many of these. I mean, there's some debate still, but there have been papers, academic papers put out now where they've done broad range of tests with like hundreds of people, and so many of them couldn't tell the difference. Now you can define that however you want. The Turing test was for those. I'm sure most people have heard of it by now, but if they haven't, it was basically put forward by Alan Turing in 1950, and he said that if there was a computer and a human both behind a curtain, and you were sending messages to them via, I think, teletype is what they used
Yeah.
back then, That, and if you couldn't tell the difference between the human and the computer, then the computer would have passed what he called the imitation game at the time, but it became known as the Turing test. And there was actually, so this is an area that I go into in more detail in this book, which is about the history of the Turing test as well. There was a prize called the Loebner Prize, which was established in the 1990s. And there are for chatbots that could get closest to passing the Turing test. And over the years, one of the ones that did pretty well was a chatbot called the Alice bot, which took on the personality of a young lady, and it won the Loebner Prize a couple of times, I think. And then there was a guy named Spike Jones who saw this Alice bot, and he said, "Oh, this is an interesting idea, an AI with the personality of a young woman." And he wrote the movie, the script for, and became the director of the movie called Her, which came out in
Oh, yeah, yeah,
2013.
yeah, yeah,
And then when ChatGPT came out with, like last year, when they came out with, I forget which version it was one of their 4.0 versions, I think. Um, and they had the voice and that sounded like Scarlett Johansson. And, there was this whole brouhaha around, are they using her voice without her permission? But at that point, they were using the movie Her. Sam Altman actually tweeted that, the movie Her, uh, as a way to get people familiar with the idea that this is now going to become like a real person who can do things for you. Or they had the videos of ChatGPT, helping the guy prepare for his interview, kind of like a girlfriend might, and buffing him up to get ready
yeah,
for the interview.
yeah,
And so you see the science fiction feedback loop, but really AI has advanced quite rapidly. And so one of the things I do is I propose the virtual Turing test or the metaverse Turing test in this book, which it would be this idea that if you were inside a video game and you were hanging out with two avatars, one of which is AI, there's something called smart NPCs now. So this is another area that I get into in the new edition of the book. If you can't tell the difference between the smart NPC and an avatar controlled by human, but remember, you can do all kinds of things in the virtual world. You can like fly around. You can say, "Hey, let's go to the amusement park. Let's dance. Let's do." There are like virtual worlds like Second Life or VR chat where people have virtual dates, virtual sex, right? All this stuff. And but there's an element of understanding the spatial coordinates around you. So the progression of AI to that is one big aspect of the book. Brain-computer interfaces is another one that has come a long way that wasn't there really before. It was just an idea with some early prototypes. But now, for example, Neuralink has had several patients implant the chip, and they're able to control video games based upon it. And there was the video of um, this monkey. This was before the human trial started. Elon Musk showed the video of a monkey playing the game Pong. And what they did was they put a chip. Now, I'm not commenting on, okay, how ethical is that to put a chip in the brain of a monkey, but
right.
just to tell you about the demo, he was playing Pong with the joystick, and they kind of taught him how to play by giving him some rewards if he played correctly and didn't. And then they disconnected the joystick. So the monkey still thought he was, controlling the game using the joystick, but he was actually using his brainwaves. And then later with the humans, they actually, demonstrated the ability to control games with using brain signals and EEG signals. And so that's another area that's come along quite a bit, along with the whole idea of virtual reality and the metaverse. So all of those things, but also I've spent more time, in the religious traditions and looking at different scriptures. And so, on the one hand, the book contains a lot of new technological information. On the other hand, I went back further and I started to delve more into the scriptures. And I found that there were just many, many more metaphors that are worth looking at that are in common across different religions. And that's why I find it interesting. And along with near-death experiences. And you find they're talking about the same kinds of things, but they're using strange metaphors, or not strange metaphors, but they're using easy to understand metaphors, but they're strangely similar. And so that's another thing that I talk about in this edition of the book as well.
And if we're in some kind of simulation or in some kind of game, how do we win?
Well, the other thing that's new in the book is there's a huge section at the end, which are the frequently asked questions. So in the past 5 years, I've interacted with hundreds of people in person, maybe thousands in person, and certainly thousands online through emails and social media. And they always ask me, similar questions, not always the
Mm.
same.
Yeah.
But the question they asked me is not, I mean, that's a good question that you're asking. The question that I get asked often is, what is the purpose of the simulation? Why
Yeah.
would we do this? And I like to say, well, uh, let me ask you two questions back. And there's a whole section of the book where I go through each of these different questions. But two questions to consider is, why do we play video games? And why do we run simulations? Right. And so the let's start with the second one. When we run simulations, we want to run them to see what will happen if we run the simulation forward. Like if you're simulating a whole civilization, or if you're simulating like the spread of a virus, or you're simulating some, what will happen to the sun after, a billion years, will it expand into super? And if you start changing parameters, you can run the simulations and rerun the simulations and see what might happen. But so that's one aspect. But the other aspect is, why do we play video games? And the reason, more or less, right, comes down to some variation of to have fun. It's to have
Yeah.
experiences that we wouldn't have in the real world. And some of those experiences cannot always be classified as pleasant experiences, right? I mean, you can go into a video game and get mauled by zombies, right? That's not exactly a pleasant experience.
Yeah.
In fact, most games, if you don't
Yeah.
have those types of challenges where you can get, a big giant spear through you or a
Yeah.
dragon to eat you, well, then the game's not any fun. Although there are, virtual worlds and metaverse type games where you're just living a virtual life. But even that's interesting because it's like people want to have a different life virtually. I mean, I used to spend a lot of time in a virtual world called Second Life. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No, I don't know that one.
It was back in 2007, 2008, 2009. It was super popular. I mean, they're still around, but they're not as well known. Back then, it was like, on the cover of like, all these magazines they were writing about. They had episodes of like The Office where, one of the guys, Dwight, was playing in Second Life. I think they even had an episode in Second Life or something. But it was you have virtual avatars and people are living their lives. And I used to spend a lot of time in there because I thought this was interesting. And I would ask people, well, why are you doing this? What are you, why are you logging in all the time? And some people would have a job in Second Life after they came home from their regular job. They would
Oh,
log in and be a bartender, let's say at a club,
yeah.
and they would get paid peanuts. They would get paid in virtual currency. It was convertible to real currency. So this is before Bitcoin and cryptocurrency really took off. In fact, that came about after the 2008 financial crisis. So this was, hit its peak kind of just before that. But it wasn't the money. It was because they valued the relationships that they had in the virtual world. Some people would be married in real life, and then they would not just be having virtual, relationships. They would have actually get married. Like they would have ceremonies with somebody in the virtual world, and it's like, oh, what are they doing? They're living an interesting fantasy life. And so I think getting back to this idea of we're trying to have experiences that maybe we can't have outside. And from that, we're perhaps trying to learn lessons, and I think that might be a good bridge with the story of Maya and Vishnu and Narada, which is an interesting story because it ties to simulation theory, but it also ties to the spiritual traditions, but it also ties to your question of, what does it mean to win the game? And so Narada was a sage or a warrior, depending on, which of the ancient scriptures you look at. And he approached the god Vishnu and he said, I want you to explain Maya to me. And Vishnu says, and if you've seen The Matrix, you'll recognize this. He says, I can't really tell you what Maya is.
Yeah.
I have to show you what Maya is. And he says, here, step into this pool of water. And so Narada steps into the pool of water, and suddenly he's not Narada anymore. He is Sushila, this little baby girl that was just born to, uh, a king and queen in somewhere in ancient India. And so Sushila grows up as a princess in this Indian kingdom. And she lives her life. She gets married to a prince from a neighboring kingdom, going through ups and downs. And then the two kingdoms are get into a war. So her husband and his kingdom fights her father and brother's kingdom, because back then, you generally had the men in charge. They end up killing each other. Okay, now she's really sad because, she's lived this whole life and, her family's members are dead. Her husband is dead. she decides to, walk out of the palace and gets out of the town. She's really sad. And there's this pool of water, and she's not really paying attention, and she just walks into the pool of water. And then suddenly she pops back, and now she's Narada again, standing next to the god Vishnu. And Vishnu says, "That is Maya.
Yeah.
Okay, you thought you were Sushila, but you were living the experience of the life of Sushila." So I would say rather than concentrating on winning, we're here to play the game, right? That's why we're here. And we have lots of challenges and quests along the way. And that there may be a part of us that's watching the game that we don't remember because we have this veil of forgetfulness. This is another one of those key metaphors that keeps
Yeah.
appearing
Yeah.
across different scriptures. Uh, but that we set up these challenges for ourselves. And so those things that we are intrigued by are part of our path. And so winning really means following our natural curiosity, but also not giving up and keeping at the challenges. Because in a video game, if you don't succeed at a quest, what do? You do it again, right? And so you have a whole series of tasks and accomplishments, and you have other people that you're drawn to. You may have quests, multiplayer quests, for example. And so in the book, in the simulation hypothesis, I talk about modeling karma as a type of algorithm that's keeping track of all of these tasks or quests or achievements that we have. And we're like constantly adding to this database. And part of the process of waking up is to fulfill those quests, to experience that, but then to reduce the number of new quests you're creating for yourself as you realize, you've had many of these experiences. Maybe you don't need to have those anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy, and also a great place to leave it. But for people watching and listening, what kind of upcoming events do you have? I know you got a bunch of stuff going on, so
Yeah. Well, I
yeah,
have a lot of talks that I'm giving. So depending on when this comes out, I'll be giving talks in New York, in Boston. I'll be doing a screening of The Matrix. I'll be speaking at the Psy Games in early August in Charlottesville, Virginia. Uh, in San Francisco, I'll be speaking at the Commonwealth Club in August. But I also have, for those interested in wisdom of a yogi, and some of the lessons, the book consists of 14 lessons. I have an online study group that's kicking off in early August. So if you are interested in being able to discuss this with myself and with a friend of mine named Lauren Beller, who runs a lot of coaching groups, they can go to my website, zenentrepreneur.com, and they can link over and sign up for this online study group that we're going to be meeting every so often to talk about the overlap of spiritual ideas, simulation ideas, and self-help and challenges in life and how we deal with them.
yeah. And again, I love the frameworks that you've applied and have made it so relatable and also kind of fun. Like I when I'm looking at your work, I it's really kind of actually fun to look at it in that way, right? Because sometimes you want to like pass a book down to somebody, say like autobiography of Yogi. It's people who haven't come across it yet, they might be, well, that one actually captures a lot of people. But if you wanted to hand over the Bhagavad Gita to somebody nowadays, unless they have like an inclination to the yogic path, they might pass on it. But something like the simulation hypothesis, I think, is kind of has similar themes that to awaken those ideas within people, right? And it's inspiring and again, kind of fun, right? To contemplate that you're in this kind of video game environment and it's I don't know, I think it's really that again it could be a very Gnostic idea, but
Yeah.
also in the modern context it's a little bit of a relief, right? And then just like because we tend to take life so seriously, which of course we should, like we're in the game, right? And
Yeah.
we should play to our best ability, right? But that idea of Maya and the simulation hypothesis that it's like we don't have to take it ultra seriously, like everything's existential, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely. And I think it's fun personally, and that's why the
yeah,
metaphor of the game is not only one for the modern world in the notion of video games, but this idea of play goes back to Leela, which is the divine
right,
play of the
yeah, yeah,
gods.
yeah,
And they talk about, Krishna's Leela, and he was being very playful. But also for us, it's, we're here to have this experience. In the Quran, I talk about this in the new version of the book as well, the Simulation Hypothesis. They actually use a similar term, El Gururi Matao in Arabic. And what that means is not just delusion. So Gururi means delusion. So that's so similar to the Maya concept, but it's an enjoyable delusion.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Enjoyable delusion doesn't mean everything is easy or great. You may have real challenges in life, but it's a fun thing for you to do is to immerse yourself in this life. And that's, I think part of the reason why we're here is to play that game.
Yeah. So I'm gonna link everything in the description. I feel like this conversation we're just scratching the surface. So I hope to talk to you again sometime soon. And I encourage everybody to check out your work. It's a really a great synthesis of modern, contemporary to ancient wisdom, technology, and again, fun stuff like video games even. So thank you so much for spending your time with us, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Yeah, sounds great. I'll definitely be happy to be on again sometime. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Take care, Riz.
Okay.